Hello, everybody. As one of my panel have just said, when trying to explain what she was doing over here, she's talking about personal history with about 300 of you. And this is the way in which oral history is made. This is the second of these personal history sessions. My name is Kate Pretty. I'm one of the university's 5 pro-vice-chancellors, but I'm also the only archaeologist among those 5. And this period that the panel is going to talk about is also my time as an archaeologist. However, I'll come back to that in a minute. Before we start, we should greet, those of us from Cambridge should greet students and staff from the universities of Manchester. I'm going to, as your university comes up, please wave and we can see whether it's true. Manchester, Liverpool, thank you, Leicester, Southampton, Reading, Oxford, Central Lancashire, hi, Kent, East Anglia, the Institute of Archaeology and University College London, Goldsmiths, University of Cambridge. And have we got students from Hills Road Sixth Form College? Yeah? Not students? Okay. Fellows of the Society of Antiquaries of London. Well done. And members of the Cambridge Antiquarian Society. Yep, super. So as you see, you're drawn from all over. And when we get to question time, I'm going to ask you to say your name and where you're from. And because there are prizes for certain questions, what your status is. Whether you're an undergraduate, a postgraduate, a postdoc. We should be thanking the funders, Thurston Shaw, the Scrabble Group, the Sorrento Hotel, the Quaker Meeting House, the Society of Antiquaries of London, the Cambridge Department of Archaeology, the MacDonald Institute of Archaeological Research, the Crowther Benyon Fund, the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, Anglia Ruskin University, and the Museum Tea Committee, who have just done their best for you. And I should add to that Pamela Jane Smith, to whom we're all very grateful indeed. Now, the running order is that the 4 panelists, if that's what you call them, will go in alphabetical order. That is, as it were, the way we decided it. So Meg Conkey will precede Henrietta Moore, who will be followed by Ruth Tringham, who will be followed by Alison Wylie, who is going to have the last word. And they're going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes on the subject of the ways in which they, in their professional and personal lives, adapted to the 1970s and 1980s in terms of archaeological theory. At least that's, I think, the brief that they've been given. During that time, those of you who were born well after that period, I should remind you that we might start the whole period with 1968 with David Clarke's Analytical Archaeology. In 1972, Lewis Binford published an archaeological perspective, which he gave a recension of in 1983 in Pursuit of the Past. But for those of you who, like me, are really cultural historians, because I'm a Romanist and early medievalist, this was a period which we almost certainly will forget as we go on through the theoretical discussions, a period in which enormous numbers of things happened technically. Philip Barker published Techniques of Archaeological Excavation in 1977. We were discovering far more material. It was a period when we could start to understand what lay beneath the ground without excavation. We had huge amounts of data. Sieving had started on archaeological sites with a recovery of vast amounts more of material, and computerization started in order to allow us not to allow us to handle this, but with an effect which allowed us to think that we could handle it. For those of you who remember that period, we were dealing in Roxeter with a Commodore PET at about this period, an unknown phenomenon to most of you. Ed Harris published Principles of Stratigraphy in 1979 in an attempt to make things more objective. And at the same period, certainly in the UK, we started to take a greater interest in public archaeology. Rescue was founded in 1971 because of the destruction to the past which had come with the boom, post-war boom in digging and in the destruction of land through deep ploughing. It's also a period in which we find ourselves with, and others will speak of this, I'm absolutely sure, Meg, the growth of interest, at least certainly among the profession, in what was happening to women. Barbara Williams published her Women in Archaeology in 1981. And it's a shock to me, and perhaps to you, that engendering archaeology didn't actually happen to come into print till 1991. And all the things which are such familiar territory to you, like who owns the past and the public policy of that, is actually relatively recent and belongs to the 90s and not to the period we're talking about now. But Henrietta and I will remember a stage where in this university we fought for the greater increase in the number of women in the university who would be able to make decisions. We belonged, she and I, to the Cambridge University Women's Action Group. And those of you who remember that stage will know that in a way what we were doing privately was beginning to invade the ideas that we had publicly. You're not here to listen to me. I am here to keep the discussion in order. So I'm going to start by asking Meg to start by telling us about herself. And the reason I'm not doing a potted bio is because your whole purpose is to listen to autobiography, not to biography. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me, or do I need to get the system from Kate? Can you all hear me? You're okay? Okay. First of all, I do want to thank, of course, Pamela Smith for organizing us and getting us here, some of us from many thousands of miles away. And I want to thank Kate, who's going to keep everybody in order. I don't know if she can keep the four of us in order. We all have quite a history of being unruly together, so we're trying to give ourselves all day. My take on this today was that we should be talking a little bit about some of the strands of connections. I'm very interested, have always been interested in sort of social networks, both in the past and in the present, so that's really what I'm going to do, is try and fill in some of the interstices of some of the kinds of things that went on. We see here the production of a number of books that we've all had some part in or something or other, but behind each and every one of them, as you all know, lie all sorts of relationships and incidences and kinds of things that happen either randomly or by chance or intentionally. I'm really concerned with the fact that the production of archaeological knowledge really is, of course, distributed knowledge, and we're all involved in the co-production of it. So from my personal history, I think it's important to point out that my beginnings in archaeology at the University of Chicago really are deeply rooted in what was then called the New Archaeology and later became called processual archaeology. At the University of Chicago, my supervisor there, Les Freeman, was part of the Binford's first generation of students, especially from the 1 year Binford taught at Chicago, and this includes people like Ken Flannery, Bob Whalen, Jim Hill, Bill Longacre, Stu Striever. And of course, prior to that was Patty Jo Watson, who was one of the few women archaeologists at Chicago, and I certainly felt the effects of being probably the fourth PhD in archaeology at Chicago at the time. Of course, at Chicago, it wasn't so much the faculty, but it was the students who actually carried the day. In fact, 1 year we had no archaeology faculty in residence, and so we convened our own seminars. And basically, this was Fred Claw, John Fritz, who happened to have been my first husband, Chuck Redman, and many other people. So you should know that there are these kinds of relations and connections. And many of them in this group, and especially, but not me, forming the core of at least the North American version of New Archaeology, actually were associated with a field school, particular archaeological summer field school in Vernon, Arizona, that spawned Mike Schiffer, Ezra Zubrow, Mark Leone, Tim Earle, and many of these other people. So that really came out from a grassroots, ground-up kind of situation. From this sphere of influence, what always influenced me or interested me was the whole idea of what we today, and even back then, were calling social geographies. And how, as even Binford talked about, the differential participation of people in the making of the styles and the material world that we dealt with as archaeologists. And so, to put it in sort of Binfordian jargon, which is actually what I came from, I was always interested in the social sources of variation in material culture. Or as Lou used to say, things like the nature and the significance of sources of variation. My own PhD dissertation, which probably people don't know too much about, was on what we call design structure and social interaction. But unlike North Americanists, this was the context of the Upper Paleolithic of Europe, and it was really inspired by two things. On the one hand, it was inspired by a paper written by Margaret Harden, then Margaret Harden Friedrich, in American Antiquity, published in 1972, on design structure and social interaction, where she dealt with pottery making among ethnographic or ethnoarchaeological population of Tarascan potters. And it was also influenced as a Paleolithic archaeologist by, as I put him, the Paleolithic archaeologist that America should have hooked up with in its Paleolithic archaeology, but never did until maybe too late, and that's André Laurent-Guérin. And Laurent-Guérin, of course, we now know was, of course, dependent upon, and his work in the structuralist vein was very much influenced by the work of Annette Lamy-Impéré, or The Woman Behind the Throne, and also by the writings of the Marxist art historian Max Raphael. So there are these deep intellectual histories that inform everything that we do. So my concerns at the time were, what can variation in material culture provide to us as archaeologists to infer social relations? And in fact, what was intended to be the first chapter of my PhD dissertation, which sat on the shelf for some time, actually ended up in the 1978 version of Social Archaeology, edited by Chuck Redmond and many others. Now, two things happened to me in the early 1970s that I can see where some of the kinds of trends have come from. This was in California. I participated in two completely separate discussion groups, both of which were quite formative. One was an archaeological discussion group mobilized by the late Lynn Isaac at Berkeley. And because of Lynn's work at looking at the development of symbolism and cultural behaviors and language and home bases in the Middle and Lower Paleolithic, he and I, with my working from the Upper Paleolithic, sort of had a lot to talk about. In fact, I would have to say that out of all of the mentors I ever had, I think Lynn was perhaps the most influential and the most encouraging mentor that I ever had. At this particular group that he organized in Berkeley, there were two people who were working on things that became part of what we think of as the 1980s, but are happening in the early 1970s. And one is a linguist, Mary LaCron Foster, a structural linguist, and the other is Jim Dietz, whose work is well known as a early a version of using, in this case, Henry Glass's structuralist approaches. And in 1977, I participated in a conference that Mickey Foster, the linguist, organized at the Berg-Vortenstein Castle of the Wenner-Gren Foundation, and I wrote a paper there which then somehow got loose. You know, papers you write, somebody picks it up and sends it to somebody, and they're sort of out there. And I think Ian Hodder had access to it probably through Linda Donnelly. And when Ian came to Binghamton, which is where I was on the faculty in the late 1970s, to a spatial analysis conference, he at that point told me he was thinking of organizing a conference on symbolic and structural archaeology, and which I did attend, and many other people attended that who had been doing some work in these lines, like Mark Leone and others, many of whose papers actually did not appear in the final edited volume. The other group that I was influenced by was meeting in the early 1970s, and this was a group of feminists and social and cultural anthropologists, and some biological ones as well, in the San Francisco Bay Area, much of which became the now classic 1974 volume edited by Michelle Rosaldo and Louise Lamphere, called Women, Culture, and Society, 1974. And the reason that I mention this is because, as Kate has just indicated, she was shocked that 1991 was when engendering, or as my French colleagues call it, endangering archaeology, was published. Is that many of us brought to all of the events that led to that actually quite a long history of engagement with some of the issues, both personally as well as professionally. I come from a long line of educated women. My great-great-grandmother got a BA from Mount Holyoke College, which I also attended. I'm the eldest of 5 daughters, and I was involved in undergraduate activism around women's issues in the 1960s. In 1972, I taught a course on women in evolutionary perspective, and also I chaired in 1975 the American Anthropological Association Committee on the Status of Women in Anthropology. And it was part of that early 1970s experience that I suggested to Mike Schiffer, then editor of Advances in Archaeological Method and Theory, that he should get somebody to do something on gender and feminism in archaeology. And as a good editor, he said, great, you're on. And he also mentioned that somebody else had approached him about this, Janet Spector, and she and I then began writing what was the 1984 publication on gender in archaeology. And it's also of note that Janet and I did all of that without ever having met each other. And this is in the days of typewriters, carbon paper, no money for long-distance phone calls, no internet, no email. And that took quite some time because we had a lot of other obligations. I was a junior faculty member, as was she. And so between 1978, when we started on it, and 1984, when it was finally published, took some time. So in a way, many of the kinds of building blocks to what we see today, some even decades later, actually are in place, and people are engaged in these kinds of ideas. And in fact, I'd just like to make one interesting point about, interesting to me anyway, about a comparison between the so-called sort of formative conference on symbolic and structural archaeology held here in 1980 here in Cambridge, and then the conference that led to engendering archaeology held in 1988. Most of the work that I think Ian drew on to put together the symbolic and structural conference was based on things that were out there, as well as the work of his own students. But when Joan Jarrow and I organized the conference that became engendering archaeology, we did not have people who were already working on a subject. We took people like Ruth, and she's well known for her response to this, and said, you really know your subject matter, your architecture, your ceramics, your archaeobotanical work. Now think it through again from the perspective of gender or feminism. We had a conference, Henrietta was a discussant, Alison was also there, and where people were asked and responded to think their materials through from a completely different perspective. And I think that that was really one of the incredible strengths of the conference. The contrast between the papers that people wrote and the papers that they submitted to the volume are very, very different. There's much more that could be said about the subsequent paths of a social archaeology, about inquiries into the meaningfulness of material culture, and especially about gender and feminist archaeologies, what today many of us refer to rather as doing archaeology as a feminist. But instead of a top-down sort of categorical approach to archaeological schools, paradigms, or whatever you might want to call it, a theoretical label, I just wanted to conclude with reminding us that it is important to remember and see how a field, a discipline, or a practice is enacted by individuals in situated practices, in varying and bottoms-up kinds of trajectories that are historically contingent and not masterminded, and like all theories have effects. That I'd like to think that when we talk about what we do as theorists in archaeology is that these are approaches that may and hopefully do change people and change the way in which people perceive the world, and that this will be different for different people situated in different places. So that's just sort of where I come from and some little tidbits. I'll turn it over to Henrietta.
Thank you.
Now, as you will recall, part of post-processual archaeology is about the interpretation or possible interpretations of meanings and the way in which they might vary. So you might be interested to know that rather than going in alphabetical order, we could also, for those of you who are interested in archaeological classification, be going in order of height. It will be very important as time goes on. Now, please don't ask me about this at all. When I was asked about what I can remember about 1979, I had total amnesia. I thought, oh my goodness, 1979. And then I remembered, of course, that it was the year of the general election. And that meant, of course, that it was also rather a good year, not because Mrs. Thatcher was elected, but because at that time we had no idea how bad it was going to get. Now, when I went on to think about what had happened as a result of the things that we all did in 1979, I went looking, rather as people have done here, for various books on the bookshelf. And I discovered one called Archaeology as Long-Term History, which I contributed an article to. And that made me very nervous, because I realized that today we would have to be doing something about the genealogy of archaeology itself, a kind of archaeology of archaeology. And I also realized, of course, that for many people in this room, I would already be history. So it was a tough one. I'm not quite sure what sort of way to talk to you about these things. Now, there are many people in this room that I was a student with. There are many people in this room who taught me, and there are many people who have been my colleagues over the years. And so I don't want to be invidious in my recollections by not mentioning people's names. But for some of you, you might like to know that I was a student with, amongst others, Danny Miller and Christopher Tilley. And what we used to do is that we used to meet pretty much every day in the coffee room of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, where we used to eat Cornish pasties from Fitzbilly's. Now, this was an enormously important activity, because when I went into the field a little while later in northern Kenya, and there was a cholera epidemic and indeed a famine, I spent much of my time dreaming about Fitzbilly's Cornish pasties, which I remember vividly. And was an interesting sort of sensate-embodied experience, which rather changed my own theoretical perspective on the value of phenomenology interpretation of what turned out to be my first book, Space, Text and Gender. Now, at that time, you have to remember that when I attended the Friday afternoon seminars in the anthropology department, that Audrey Richards was still alive. I did not know then that I would, with Megan Vaughan, do a major study of her first, well actually her second. Her PhD was on food, but her second book on the Bender. Maya Fortis was still alive and regularly attended those seminars, as was Edmund Leach. Edmund Leach and I had a number of run-ins whilst I was a student, because one of the things about being a PhD student, and this may not apply to those of you who are PhD students at the moment, but it certainly applied to me, is that you're too young and stupid to know that you ought to be politer than you are. I was forever putting my foot in it in a variety of ways. And Edwin and I had a famous run-in over the question, of course, of whether feminism was simply a kind of ideology or not. And he said to me, the trouble with you is that you don't know that you are an ideologue, right? And I said, the trouble with you is that you won't say that you are one. Right? So something he subsequently repeated in print. I got politer and didn't, of course. Now, actually, the 1970s were a time of immense intellectual optimism in Cambridge. Immense intellectual optimism. I mean, we really thought we were changing something. I have to say that from time to time we were a little bit unclear about exactly what it was we were saying, but we did think that we were moving things forward. And I think that one of the reasons why we thought that was that there was a kind of confluence between the passion we felt for the work that we were doing and the kinds of theoretical frameworks that we were trying to develop within that work. That is, that we were interested in a kind of social theory that created space for human agency, for interpretation, for a kind of creative practice. And that informed not only what we were doing in our work, but as Kate has mentioned for some of us in our political work as well. And I was not only a member, of which I'm enormously proud to have been a member of the Cambridge University Women's Action Group, but I was also a member of something called the Cambridge Women's Resource Centre, which was something which tried to get women from the town and women from the university, or from Gown and Town as it was then known, together to do something about women's employment and women's training in the city of Cambridge. And we were largely successful because we had backing from the university, in fact from Jesus College substantially in the first instance. And that kind of feminist activism that we were involved in was an enormously important part of the way in which I approached my work. It was an enormously important part because I was interested in the question of political economy. I was interested in the question of what difference do systems of production and reproduction make to the way that people are able to live their lives, and how men and women are differentially placed within those systems. And this was something that formed the basis, really, of my first PhD work in Kenya. Now, I think that Danny Miller and Chris Tilley and I, and a number of other people, we used to meet regularly as a group to discuss various kinds of theoretical texts. The chief problem with these discussions was that Danny Miller and Chris Tilley always wanted to discuss Hegel, and nobody else did. Now, I, as a result, can't remember too much about Hegel, because this is a sort of form of amnesiac resistance which the rest of us were practicing at the time. But out of those discussions did come a very sustained critique of a number of different kinds of thinkers. Of course, first of all, we had Tony Giddens on our doorstep, and we talked much about human intention and motivation, much about the problem of what is, as he had said, the great problem of social theory, which is the relationship between structure and agency. And out of that, I, in my own work, developed an interest in the writings both of Pierre Bourdieu and his writing on habitus, and of the work of Paul Ricoeur. And I think that's an important development for me, because at the time, post-processual archaeology was gaining a great deal, not only from sort of the ideas of interpretation, but from structuralism itself. And you must remember that the great texts of structuralism which were underpinning post-processual archaeology in the early 1980s were actually, most of them, published in French in France in the 1950s. And these ideas had been around for quite some time. Whereas both Bourdieu and Ricoeur were moving in slightly different directions. Bourdieu, of course, much more towards the embodied nature of structuring structures, and Ricoeur much more against or away from simple ideas of alternation, transposition, the basic structural principles of language, towards an idea of what did it mean for people to actually speak in sentences competently. So he wasn't a Chomskyan, but he had an idea of how you would approach the interpretation of a text at large. And that's the idea that I took forward in space text and gender. And from there, everything really began. Now, Kate, how am I doing on time?
5 more minutes?
Oh, okay. Right. Okay, that's great.
You don't have to.
Okay, good. Well, maybe just a couple more things. So I benefited enormously from the fact that I met Meg Conkey in 1980 when I was a graduate student. I think that's probably one of the most marvellous things that ever happened to me, and one of the most satisfying intellectual relationships. And that spun off into one with Ruth and one with Alison. As Meg said earlier, we've been renowned for many years now for causing quite a lot of trouble together. And what satisfaction it has given us. It's a pleasure to work with three really great minds on all kinds of issues. And I have truly, really enjoyed being, as I now am thought of, as the anthropologist who hangs out with archaeologists. It's been a huge treat, and I'm going to stop there.
Thank you.